and just in time to analyze and theorize on the new Fazbear Frights book. This first video is going to be focused on Step Closer with a summary of the story and what this story could mean to the series. Spoiler warning for Step Closer, and you have been warned. The story begins with a divorced family. This family includes Pete, the older brother, Chuck, the younger brother, and Mom and Dad, who are divorced. Pete, becoming isolated from his family, and a jerk to his younger brother, seems to be repercussions of the divorce. One example of him being isolated is turning down all of his mom's ideas, including becoming an organ donor upon his death. Since neither Mom nor Dad want to take care of Chuck, Pete is forced to haul Chuck around with him against his own will. On a particular day, Pete is dragged along with Chuck to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, but he had a better plan in mind. Pete proceeded to drag Chuck into the maintenance room and scare him using the broken down Foxy animatronic. Right as Pete hits the on button, Chuck runs off back to his friends, but Foxy still turns on, stuck on the same song lyric. You can be a pirate too, but first you'll have to lose an eye and an arm. Pete and Chuck go home, and it seems that they agree on a mediocre truce. The next day, Pete is feeling sick, but goes to school anyways, which was a horrible mistake. During frog dissection in science class, Pete bumps into a guy and falls down, knocking the wind out of himself. The guy's scalpel goes flying, and the midair scalpel redirects its destination straight at Pete's eye. He swats it away, but this was the beginning of the incidents. Next, while Pete was tasked with going home to pick up some meat at the butcher shop, a butcher cleaver falls out of its rack, narrowly missing his hand. Then, on his way home, near a construction site, a buzzsaw goes flying and almost hits him, but only cuts his hand. You can be a pirate, but first you'll have to lose an eye and an arm. Pete is forced to go fishing with his father, but ends up with a fish hook caught in his cheek. Pete goes to a school event and gets his arm stuck in a prank finger trap. After getting his arm out of the large spring, his arm is purple, having the blood flow cut off. You can be a pirate, but first you'll have to lose an eye and an arm. He goes into a funhouse, gets lost, and runs into a dart-throwing carnival game, where he gets a dart thrown at his eye, hitting him right below it. You'll have to lose an eye and an arm. Pete realizes that all of his incidents and misfortune are being caused by Foxy, and he needs to go back and face him in the maintenance room. He sends a text to Chuck, detailing his epiphany, and tells him to meet him back at Freddy's to finish this. Pete then runs out into the road, where he is hit by a truck. He wakes up in what he thinks is a hospital, where he can't move at all. He soon comes to realize that he has died from the accident, and now is in the morgue to have his organs collected for donation. He watches helplessly as the doctors cut off his hand and take his eyes. 4 weeks after the death of Pete, Chuck goes back to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza to face Foxy once and for all. He goes to the maintenance room, where Foxy is still broken down and unrepaired. Chuck hits the on button, but the animatronic remains dormant and broken. Now, this story is very interesting, and in my opinion the second most complicated story, but also possibly the story with the most important lore reveals. I'm pretty sure I know what happened in the story, and have also gathered what this story may be pointing at lore-wise, so let's begin. To understand what the story is implying, we first need to explain exactly what happened to begin with. So, the story begins with Pete, Chuck, and their family, who are pretty symbolic of the Afton family, with Pete as the Foxy brother, and Chuck as the crying child. So, with that idea, we can relate things that happen in the story to those certain characters. Now, about Foxy, there are two possible scenarios that could work to explain what he does in the story. As described on the back of the book, Pete falls to a gruesome curse, but what is this curse? Well, after attempting to scare Chuck, it seems that Foxy did something to Pete to cause his misfortune. These misfortunes focus mostly on bodily harm, specifically directed at the eyes and arms. The last and certainly worst part of the curse is still being conscious and sentient even after death. What's crazy about this, though, is that this isn't the first time this has happened. The doctors can't seem to close Pete's eyes and comment that this isn't the first time this has happened, but they brush it off. Now, about the bodily harm directed at Pete, it seems to be sort of an aura, like a field surrounding him, causing these bad things to happen. The brothers make a note about how it may be karma, but it seems to be more of a spiritual aura. Now, I need to get to the point. How does Foxy do this? The obvious answer is that Foxy is possessed by Fritz and vengeful against Pete, being mean to his younger brother, where he haunts Pete till his death and lets him suffer after his death. Now, the other, less obvious answer, but more plausible idea, is something I like to call William Afton's judgment principle. This is the idea that certain creations of William have a sort of alternate protocol. This protocol makes the creations judge their current owner, and if the creation is mistreated, it will then torment the owner. Some good examples of this are Lonely Freddy and Ella from 1:35 a.m. In Lonely Freddy, Alec is kind of a jerk and ends up stuck in Lonely Freddy. Note that in 1:35 a.m., Ella never tormented her previous owner, but once she got thrown away by Delilah, all hell broke loose. Foxy could be the same way, where he only torments bad peoples, as, let's be honest, Pete is a pretty big jerk in the story. It would make sense as to why Chuck repeats the scenario of turning on Foxy and doesn't get cursed. It's just William judging the world for its sins. Now that that story's been explained, I think there's one main point to what the story is pointing at: Michael. The story may very well be pointing at the true identity of Michael Afton, which has been a big debate for quite a while. Here's a small realization that came from Emperor Krakoa, who was the guest on the Happy State podcast, episode 2, which is on Ozone's channel, if you want to check it out. In the story, Pete is almost constantly chewing gum, having it referenced in the story anywhere from 6 to 10 times. This is a direct callback to the survival logbook, where on a page about bad habits, Michael writes about chewing gum excessively. So, both Michael and Pete have a chewing gum problem, and Pete is symbolic of the older brother, so wow. Finally, Scott is pointing towards an answer. Before this, both MikeBot and MikeBro have been more or less equally acceptable interpretations, but finally we're getting pointed towards one by Scott himself. A couple smaller details are Pete's arm becoming purple after getting it stuck in the spring, and him staying alive after his death. The story has me pretty convinced that Michael is in fact the older brother, but there's still one kink which I may explain if you guys want to hear it in a future video. Now that's about all for this video, and if you want to see videos on the other stories in the book, stay tuned, because those should be coming very shortly. And thank you for watching. I will see you guys in the next video.